Hello and welcome back to IdeaSexx, where we take an analytical lens to mystical and spiritual phenomena. If you're new here, welcome to the guild. We are currently on a spiritual awakening kick because of this Google search trend. And today I'd like to continue the conversation we've been having about awakening by talking about what I think it is this mass awakening is leading us toward. And that is conscious evolution. Conscious evolution is the idea that when we individually take responsibility for our own healing and our own growth, we can collectively shift our species' future. And this is a really unique opportunity because most evolution isn't conscious. For example, random example, but camels evolved to have a third eyelid or a nictitating membrane, word of the day. And they have this because they live in places that are sandy and windy as fuck. It's a response to the environment. Sea creatures, fishy things, have fins because they live in water. Giraffes have long necks because they need to nom on the top of treetops, right? These are all in response to the environment. But we humans, we're a little different. You and I actually have a lot of control over how we evolve. Humans are the only creatures that can hold a vision in our imagination, in our mind's eye, and bring it into existence. We're like tiny gods, or we're like divinity light. When we experience a spiritual awakening, we are taking our personal evolution by the reins. And in this video, I'd like to explore how. So we're going to take a look at what actually happens in our brains during a spiritual awakening, how it triggers growth and healing, and how this trend in mass awakening could be leading us toward the heaven on earth that has been prophesized about and prayed for in cultures all over the world for most of human history. In previous videos, we've defined awakening as becoming aware of the chattering in our egoic mind and no longer identifying with it. And Eckhart Tolle has written more about this phenomenon than anyone, as far as I know, so we'll be drawing on a lot of his work, but regardless of who the teacher is, they all talk about spiritual awakening in similar terms. It's something that happens when we become aware of that voice in our head and we realize that it's not who we truly are. The egoic mind is the constant internal dialogue we're having with ourselves. And in most of us, the ego is a negative entity because not only does it not want to shut up, but like 90% of the time, it's not even being helpful, right? During a spiritual awakening, we become more aware of our thoughts. We start to listen to ourselves. We are a witness to our internal processes. And what a lot of people realize is that a lot of the conversation in our head is negative, repetitive, and sort of useless. I think of the unchecked egoic mind as being like a hamster on a wheel in our head, and it's just squeaking and squeaking, and it doesn't want to stop. It may even keep us up at night. Like, I don't know if you've ever had a hamster, but those little buggers are nocturnal, and their favorite time to run a little hamster marathon is at 3 in the goddamn morning. But here's the thing. Because the hamster never stops, it's always going, it's like white noise. We don't even notice that it exists until it stops, whether through meditation or ecstasis, flow state, trauma, psychedelics, anything that triggers that moment of awakening. For a moment, the hamster stops. So when it starts up again, we become conscious of this annoying squeaking noise. For the first time, we awaken to the fact that we have a pet hamster, and we give that hamster a name, ego. Okay, so the catalyst for a spiritual awakening is becoming aware of ego and realizing that our thoughts aren't us, right? They are a byproduct of our conditioning, of our programming. A lot of our thoughts aren't even true. And as we realize that, we start to disassociate from them. As a result, it is not uncommon for people experiencing an awakening to feel scared, unstable, like they're walking in a dream, like they're going crazy, because what's happening is we are unhinging our identity from the narrative in our heads. And who are we? If not the roles we play, the things that have happened to us, the things we like and dislike, the way we dress and talk, who are we? If not the stories we tell about ourselves. When we start to unravel this mental narrative about who we think we are and what reality is, we arrive at what the Buddha called anatta, or no self. And I was really curious to figure out if anyone had studied on what's going on neurologically when this happens. So in addition to Eckhart Tolle, the two books that have helped me make the most sense of this so far are 𝗕𝗵𝗲, which we talked about in the Unity Consciousness video, and No Self, No Problem, how neuropsychology is catching up to Buddhism. And in this book, Dr. Ｃris 𝗕𝗵𝗲 shows us how findings in neuropsychology suggest that our sense of self is actually an illusion created by the left side of the brain, and that it exists in the same way a mirage in the middle of the desert exists, as a thought, rather than a thing. And there were some really amazing studies in 𝗕𝗵𝗲 that validated this idea that our sense of self, right, I, me, mine, myself, the ego, is actually just a network in our brain. It doesn't really exist. In No Self, No Problem, the author talks about our brain as being like this peanut-shaped thing, and the left side is analytical and the right side is creative and intuitive. In reality, you could imagine it's more complicated than like our left peanut versus our right peanut, but we use the language left and right because those parts of our brain generally correlate to certain functions. So we can say that the left brain houses our linguistic center, language and everything associated with it, right? So writing, speech, comprehension. The left brain also loves to categorize things, to divide things, to interpret things. And for this reason, I think of our ego as being our inner storyteller. And this is not a popular opinion in a lot of spiritual circles. In a lot of spiritual circles, I think the ego is sort of villainized as being something bad. And in my opinion, that view is a little too black and white. The ego is the part of us that is always telling stories about reality, right? The world around us, who we are, who other people are, what their motives might be. And so if the right brain is like this intuitive, silent witness to our experiences, the left brain is the interpreter of those experiences. And for that reason, the two halves of our brain actually make a great team. The right brain is like, you know, sitting back, taking it all in, and the left brain is actively engaged in the world, telling stories about it. It's very yin-yang. The problem is, the ego, the left brain, doesn't always tell good stories, mostly because we aren't conscious of the fact that we're telling stories. 𝗕𝗵𝗲 makes the argument that the left brain is so dependent on language that it often mistakes the map of reality for reality itself, right? Or as the Zen adage goes, we confuse the menu with the food. In his words, our association of our true self with the constant voice in our head is an instance of mistaking the map, the voice, for the territory, who we really are. This error is one of the biggest reasons the illusion of self is so difficult to see. And when we really start to mistake the map for the territory, right, the voice in our heads for reality, that's when we humans really start to create trouble for ourselves. One of my favorite lines in this book was something to the effect of, people kill and die for their beliefs all the time, but only for the beliefs they don't realize are just beliefs. But our left brain is constantly making assumptions about what's true and what's not. Let's be pragmatic about this. We each have countless beliefs, and no one else on earth shares all of our beliefs, right? In fact, people have vastly different beliefs. We tell vastly different stories about the world and our place in it. And yet, some people have the audacity to assume that only their beliefs, only their thoughts are correct, and everyone else, if they disagree, is wrong. The probability of that is less than zero. So in my opinion, truth is like the parable of the 4 blind men and the elephant, right? So 4 men are born blind and they are all asked to touch an elephant and describe it. The man who touches the trunk says the elephant is like a snake. The one who hugs its side says an elephant is a wall. The one who grabs its leg says it's like a tree. And the one who holds onto its tail says an elephant is like a rope. And they're all kind of right. And yet so often our egoic mind latches onto our beliefs like they're absolute truth, right? Like, fuck your creamy peanut butter, there's only crunchy. Or a more realistic example being American politics right now, right? It's just this game of red versus blue. Like, have you ever tried, keyword, to have a conversation with someone who has way different political beliefs than you? Come on, I'll bet you've gotten into at least one spat on Facebook. And as we all know, those conversations very quickly blow up and very slowly go nowhere. Why? Because politics revolve around some of our most deeply held beliefs, beliefs that we don't even realize are beliefs because we identify so strongly with them. Same thing with religion, right? And Eckhart Tolle calls this form identification. Tolle really only talks about the shadow side of the ego, and so his definition of it primarily revolves around the fact that the ego wants to ensure its survival above anything else, right? So remember, the ego, the left brain, it loves to categorize and it loves to divide. Its favorite division, its favorite category is I, me, mine, myself versus everything else. And so the ego wants to ensure the survival of this division, right? Myself, more than anything. Tolle tells us that it does this by forming attachments. And these attachments can be physical, they can be mental, right? So physical being material wealth, people, groups of people. So, when someone's car is an extension of themselves, when we lose ourselves in a relationships, when we get really tribal about our favorite sports teams. And then it can also be mental, so thoughts, beliefs, emotions. But whether it's physical or mental, form identification is what happens when we become so attached to something that it becomes part of our identity, who we think we are. Now, when we identify with a form, any threat to that form becomes a threat to our survival. And this is why people can get triggered by weird shit. Let's use an example from Tolle. So you take a toy away from a child and they cry. Not because of any intrinsic value that the toy has, the child will soon lose interest in it and it will be replaced by other toys, other objects, but because of the thought of mine. The toy became part of the child's developing sense of self, of I. And so as the child grows up, the original I thought attracts other thoughts to itself. It becomes identified with a gender, possessions, the sense-perceived body, a nationality, race, religion, profession. Other things the I identifies with are roles: mother, father, husband, wife, and so on, accumulated knowledge or opinions, likes and dislikes, and also things that happened to me in the past, the memory of which are thoughts that further define my sense of self as me and my story. And that's the word that I think is so important here and brings this part full circle. Story. The ego is just telling stories, and if we don't realize those stories are made up, it can cause a lot of unnecessary suffering. When we experience a spiritual awakening, all of these stories start to unravel. We begin to see through the illusion. And my hypothesis, my working hypothesis, is that as we pull out of left brain consciousness, we start to experience more right brain consciousness. Right brain consciousness is quite different than left brain consciousness. If the left brain is the interpreter, the right brain is the witness. The left brain divides, the right brain unifies. The left brain is action-oriented, it's yang. The right brain is receptive, it's yin. Whereas the left brain tends to look at things through a very narrow scope. The right brain sees the big picture, right? How everything interconnects. If the left brain uses language, the right brain uses imagery and gut instincts. If the left brain is the analyst, the right brain is the intuitive. And this is why I think some people's spiritual awakenings often coincide with psychic or kundalini awakenings, because this creative, intuitive energy starts to circulate. Right brain consciousness also feels good. It's how we feel after meditation or being in a flow state, right? Right brain consciousness is associated with emotions like love, compassion, gratitude, being present. There's actually an incredible case study in this book, No Self, No Problem, about a neuroanatomist who suffered a stroke, and her left brain essentially shuts off for a while, but when she fully recovers and is able to use language again, what she says is, I became detached from the memories of my life, and I was confronted by an expanding sense of grace. She could no longer perceive the boundaries of where she ended, and everything else began. She felt her being as fluid rather than solid. She was totally present in the moment, embodied in tranquility. Categories such as good, bad, and right, wrong were experienced as a continuum rather than disconnected opposites. Her left brain ego, which viewed herself as separate, was no longer dominant in her consciousness. Her right brain, or perhaps her right mind, that's a Buddhist pun, I like that, she felt gratitude and a sense of contentment. The right brain was compassionate, nurturing, and eternally optimistic. In her words, I think the Buddhists would say I entered the mode of existence they call nirvana. Her experience, interestingly enough, aligns really closely with some of the studies talked about in Stealing Fire. My favorite one I talked about in the Unity Consciousness video, where Christian nuns and Buddhist monks would enter intense prayer and meditation. And at the peak of these practices, parts of their brain would shut down, the parietal lobe specifically. And as a result, they would experience total oneness, or what the nuns call oneness with God's love. And I feel like if there is any absolute truth, it's this idea of oneness. And just to use the books on this table as an example, they come from very different worlds, right? Different genres, and they're all saying the same thing. Stealing Fire is almost sports science, right? Stephen Kotler and Jamie Wheal, the authors, do a lot of research around flow states in high-performance athletes. In this book, they also talk about Navy SEALs, Google executives, Burning Man attendees, and how these people shift into an altered state of consciousness. In No Self, No Problem, this state of consciousness is explored through neuropsychology. And in Tolle, he explores the same idea through a spiritual lens, a lens that might be kind of woo-woo to some people. And so it seems to me that we can look at any facet of the human experience, religion, philosophy, art, science, and they're all like spokes on a wheel pointing inward to a central truth. And I think the pinnacle of a spiritual awakening is when we acknowledge that oneness, when we step out of the divisions created by the ego and experience more right brain consciousness, when we remember what we are, which is one consciousness manifesting as infinite possibilities. I'm going to say that a million times on this channel. We should be screaming it from the mountaintops, from the rooftops, from the laptops, because it's the goddamn T with a capital T. God damn it, I made a mess. Okay, this is fine. Okay, so we have an idea of what's going on in our heads during a spiritual awakening. We are pulling out of left brain consciousness and experiencing more right brain consciousness. We are disassociating from the egoic mind and realizing we are part of something infinitely bigger. Okay, now what? It is but the beginning of a perhaps endless journey in healing and self-mastery. Eckhart Tolle talks about this in A New Earth. He says, to recognize one's own insanity is, of course, the arising of sanity, the beginning of healing and transcendence. And this applies on the individual level as well as the collective level. So during a spiritual awakening, we start to become aware of our thoughts. And when that happens, we start to wonder where those thoughts come from, right? Like the ego is always chattering, and we hear it now, but where does it get these ideas from? On the level of the individual, some of it is going to be very specific to our family culture, to our lineage, things like codependency, fears, insecurities, limiting beliefs. A lot of these tend to be the result of generational trauma and ancestral wounding. That's IdeaSexx for another time. We will get into that when we start talking about healing modalities, specifically shamanism. But suffice to say that part of spiritual awakening is realizing the parts of us that have been programmed by our family culture, things that we have inherited. Think of it as like your parents' baggage, but it actually goes back way further in most cases. If our ancestral lineage, our family, programs us individually, we are also programmed collectively by our societal systems. So I think specifically of government, media, and school. And this is why I was compelled to talk about QAnon in that last video, because regardless of whether or not you believe in anything Q-related, I think the reason that movement has the traction it does is because a lot of people realize that the systems in place don't program us in a way that serves us. They have created a reality, call it a matrix, that only serves an elite few. And so people who experience a spiritual awakening often realize they've been sold a lie. Our schools program us to believe that we're meant to grow up and trade our time for money, 40 hours a week, and you'll hopefully have enough savings to retire at 65 when you've got maybe 10, 15 years left in you. And if we buy into that, a lot of us will die unfulfilled, but that's what our schooling is programming us for. That's the first system, schooling. The second system is our media. When we grow up and we start doing work that we don't find meaningful, it sort of feels like a lot of our time on this planet is wasted, right? We feel empty inside. In swoops the media, telling us that in order to fill this void, all we have to do is buy things. This is like throwing gasoline on the fire of the ego. In a consumerist society, the ego is being encouraged to attach itself to so many different things, right? We want to consume it all: wealth, beauty, status, and all the gadgets and thingamadoos we think are going to get us more of that. And so we get eaten up by this system where we do work we don't really like in order to buy things we don't really need, in order to attempt to fill this void. Rinse and repeat. And that plays into the third system. The consumerism is perpetuated by governments that are always at war. And, you know, we like to pretend that it's for a noble cause, but the past 15, 20 years, in my opinion, have shown us that our warfare is mostly about resources, right? We act like it's for a noble cause, weapons of mass destruction, you know, carpet bomb in the name of democracy, but the actions would suggest that all of this has been about oil. And that's because we need the resources to fuel this broken system. Whether or not you agree with that, people who experience a spiritual awakening often become disillusioned with the status quo for one reason or another, right? This is what I think. And I think they become disillusioned with these systems because we become aware of the voice in our heads. We realize that voice isn't us, right? It's programming. We wonder where that programming came from, and we trace it back to these broken systems. And that's when people want out, right? They're like, fuck the matrix. I'm going to start my own mission-driven business. I'm going to live in a nude commune. I'm going to be self-sufficient in an off-grid van powered by solar energy, right? It can go a number of directions. Regardless of what you believe or how you arrive there, I think it's amazing when we start to become aware of our programming, because this is the beginning of freedom. This is us taking our power back, our sovereignty, when we realize that most of the stories we tell ourselves are unconsciously programmed, right? By family, society, trauma, past experiences. Only then can we begin the work of reprogramming. And it's in this gradual liberation that we become what I like to call conscious co-creators. Conscious because we are aware of our inner processes, right? The stories we're telling ourselves. And then being jointly, and creator being one who brings something into existence. So back to my unpopular opinion from earlier. I know I have a lot of them. I don't think the purpose of a spiritual awakening is to extinguish the ego. I think it's about bringing our egoic and intuitive minds into harmony. When we start to wake up, rather than just accepting the stories of the ego as truth, we can be receptive to them. With our intuitive right brain consciousness, we can better explore the validity of the stories we're telling. In fact, our right brain consciousness allows us a lot of times to see beyond limiting stories. We can see a bigger picture, right? This exchange between the left and right brain, ego and intuition, this is the in co-creator. It is bringing these parts of our mind into coherence. And the creator part of conscious co-creator is that we are no longer slaves to the programming. We are the makers of that programming. That was a lot of theory. So let's talk about what this looks like in practice. There are countless examples we could give of programming, of the stories we tell ourselves. But if you want to know what your specific stories are, there is an easy method we can borrow from cognitive behavioral therapy. By the way, we will get into like psychology and stuff in the future when we start talking about healing modalities. But today I just want to touch on this particular thing briefly. So CBT is based on this idea that our thoughts trigger our emotions and our emotions trigger our behaviors. So for example, we have a thought. That person cut me off because they are a selfish asshole. That triggers an emotion. That emotion is anger. And as a result of that anger, we exhibit some kind of behavior. We honk, we flip them off, we say something about their mother. So thought, emotion, behavior. In CBT, the idea is that if we want to change a behavior in ourselves, something that we do again and again and we don't like it, we have to catch ourselves in that chain reaction as early as possible. So it's difficult if not impossible, to be constantly aware of our thoughts, right? So it's best to catch these things at the stage of emotion. Whenever we feel any kind of negativity, rather than taking an external action, we can turn inward and ask ourselves what triggered that emotion. And we can always trace it back to a thought. And once we've identified the thought, we can explore the validity of that thought. We can ask ourselves, well, is that even true? Should I even think that? Actually, I have a story that I think is pretty funny that relates to this. It's funny to me. So a couple weeks ago, a gentleman became very angry with me for not having texted back. And his angry words toward me, that's the behavior, right? The words were the results of an emotional state. And we can make some assumptions as to what that might have been. He may have felt rejected. He may have felt disrespected. Whatever the emotion, it was triggered by a thought. And the thought must have been something that me not texting back was personal, right? So he was telling himself this story where the reason I was texting back, wasn't texting back, had something to do with him. The truth is, I had a very serious infection and was trying to figure out how I was going to drive myself out of buttfuck nowhere, Arizona, to some place with a hospital. And as I was trying to figure this out, I just passed the fuck out. I wasn't ignoring anyone. I was asleep. And we've all done this at some point, right? Where someone has ghosted us, or we have that friend that never remembers to text back. And it's really easy to take that stuff personally, to make up a story where it has something to do with us. But the difference between us feeling bad in that situation or being okay with it is just a story, right? We can take it personally, or we can assume that someone's busy or, unconscious. So anyone can learn to be aware of their thoughts like this and choose better feeling thoughts. CBT is an amazing tool, but questioning our thoughts, the validity of our thoughts, becomes much easier after a spiritual awakening because we're no longer identified with our thoughts. We're no longer clinging to them. So they're easier to change. As I've practiced this part of CBT, one of the things I've noticed is that it's not always a thought. Sometimes it's deeper. Sometimes it's a belief. And this isn't CBT, as far as I know. This is kind of me making shit up, but it feels right. So hear me out and let me know what you think. In the same way that a thought creates an emotion and an emotion creates a behavior, a belief creates a state of mind, and our state of mind creates our circumstances, our reality. Thoughts and beliefs are related. When we think something often enough, we believe it, right? A belief is just a constant thought that is calcified. If a thought is a one-night stand, if it's a fling, something that comes in and out, then a belief is something that takes up a more permanent residence in our brain. And so whereas a thought can create a moment of pain or a moment of joy, our beliefs shape our general mental, emotional state, right? The way we feel about the world, about ourselves. And that determines our reality. Another example that I think a lot of people could relate to is the idea of worthiness, right? Feeling like we're not enough. Brene Brown, she's somewhere up here, has written extensively about this. And it's something that we don't talk about a lot because it's shameful for a lot of people. But the truth is, worthiness is a universal struggle. And there's all kinds of reasons why people may not feel good enough, but it is always the result of programming, right? Our past experiences, the expectations laid on us by our family, by society, expectations that we then adopt because we believe they're true. And so if we believe we're unworthy, you can imagine how that would manifest in our mental emotional space, right? Things like eating disorders, social anxiety, chronic depression. It doesn't have to be like an illness. It could be being too critical. It could be taking things personally. It could be being too sensitive to criticism. In any case, if we believe we're not good enough, that becomes the unconscious programming we're running all the time. And it's going to determine our reality. If we do not believe in our worthiness, we will always be holding ourselves back from our true potential, from feeling good. We'll probably miss out on the opportunities of a lifetime because we're going to settle for things that don't totally fulfill us. At best, we'll settle for things that are lukewarm and kind of content because we don't think we deserve anything radiant, joyful, things that light us up from the inside. And guess what? That feeling of unworthiness is just a story that our left brain has told us again and again until it becomes part of who we think we are. These are just a couple examples of common programming that a spiritual awakening might inspire us to throw in the garbage where that ship belongs. But here's the thing. We always have to replace the programming, right? And this is what is not acknowledged in a lot of spiritual circles. We're never just going to be able to extinguish the ego. We're never going to be able to totally shut it off, right? To be human is to be a storyteller. And so my thing is, if we're going to tell stories, let's tell stories that are good for ourselves and the people around us. Just speaking from my personal experience and what I've seen in my circle, when people start telling themselves better stories, kinder stories, more empowering stories, their quality of life changes drastically, right? They're able to find work they love, connect with people they trust, get into a groove that works for them. And all it is a change in story. We have covered a lot in this video. If you've made it this far, I'm impressed with you. So let's bring it full friggin' circle. How is the mass spiritual awakening leading to conscious evolution? So a spiritual awakening causes us to become aware of the ego, right? This repetitive, often negative tape that's playing in our heads. We understand that these thoughts are the result of programming. We clear out this programming and heal from what didn't serve us, and then we reprogram, becoming conscious co-creators. These 4 steps are an evolution in consciousness, and maybe that evolution never really ends, right? Like, unless we attain enlightenment or something, I feel like this reprogramming is as endless as we want it to be. Regardless of a final destination, the journey is one of healing, growth, and transformation. And that transformation is a result of reining in the stories of our left brain and stepping more into our right brain consciousness and all the things associated with it, right? Love, compassion, intuition, unity, gratitude, being present. And so I feel like maybe rather than trying to transcend the ego and become Jesus, like Eckhart Tolle instructs us, I wonder if it might make more sense to try to temper the left brain tendencies with all the intuition and the gentleness and the feeling of the right brain. That being said, the ego has created a lot of problems, like all the problems in our modern world, right? It's like we've got these 2 parts of us, ego and intuition, yin, yang, order, chaos, anima, animus, chaos, order. Did I say that one? But there's these dualities, right? And we are terribly imbalanced right now, especially in the West. We live in a very left-brained society, and our systems are a product of this. It's funny because we had talked about in the beginning, evolution, like the creature is the product of the environment. In a lot of cases with humans, our environment is the product of us. And so because we operate from the egoic mind, mostly, our systems are built on division and control. As we collectively wake up and step more into right brain consciousness, the systems no longer serving us are beginning to crumble, right? Call it the matrix, the patriarchy, I don't know, call it whatever. But really, it's just these systems that are built on control and division instead of love. And what's happening right now is that those systems are on their way out. What comes next is our choice. If enough of us do the healing, the reprogramming on an individual level, it will be reflected in the collective. When it is reflected in the collective, it will be reflected in our system. So when I extrapolate on this graph, what I see is us headed for a more balanced era, a more peaceful era, should we survive the death throes of our existing system. And we'll get into this more in a future video, but we humans actually have blueprints for a possible utopia. We have developed the kinds of technologies and we have conceptualized the kinds of economies that could theoretically create heaven on earth, but they are radical ideas. They will make people uncomfortable. For those of us who have stepped outside of the egoic construct, these ideas make a lot of sense. So it is possible, but we're racing the clock because the big shift is unfolding right now, and we can use the momentum of it to carry us to that better, higher place, to rise, to consciously evolve, or we can let it carry us down into something apocalyptic. Whether we go up or whether we go down depends on how many of us can wake up and do the work. Because in the same way that our individual spiritual awakening leads us to become conscious co-creators in our own lives, the mass spiritual awakening leads us to conscious evolution. If enough of us make a decision to evolve in a direction, to create in a direction, we choose our future. And so the question we should be asking ourselves as we collectively wake up is, what do we want the new earth to look like? What kind of story are we going to tell? That is it for today. I would love to have IdeaSexx with you in the comments, so if you'd like, go ahead and share your thoughts, opinions, anecdotes, shoot me down in flames, whatever. I'm into it. And until next time, stay blessed.